We begin this epic journey by adding a dry brush layer of glacier blue onto the very hard edges of the vehicle. Now I know edge highlighting isn't really in vogue when it comes to Heroes Heresy modelling, but we don't need to edge highlight everything into oblivion. Have a look at how I manipulate the brush on those hard surfaces. I'm tapping, I'm stabbing, I'm creating texture, I'm creating a weathering layer at this very early stage, as well as highlighting the vehicle, as well as defining the plates. It's one thing having a miniature that is weathered to the point of oblivion, where you can't see the lines of the sculpt any longer. It's another thing to use the weathering to really show off the sculpt, and that's what we are doing here. I'm using an angular brush with a... so I haven't diluted the paint. It's not quite a dry brush consistency. The paint is still damp enough to come off the brush very easily, but I do not want it overly dry. I don't want it overly wet. I want it just right, just perfect. Perfect consistency for this, just straight out of the pot. With Glacier Blue, it does come in a drop bottle, so you will need to put it onto a palette beforehand. Next stage, I will be further adding to the chipping effect, again using Glacier Blue, but this time I'm using a sponge to create that chip. Now, wherever you think you traditionally place an edge highlight, that's where you'd want to concentrate the chipping effect, because those hard areas, those hard edges, would naturally come into more surface contact with things that would chip them up. Towards the middle of the hull, it would be the incidental fleck of hail or bullet or whatever hitting it. It's incidental, whereas the edges of the vehicle will come in for a lot more damage and wear and tear. So that's where we do want to concentrate our this stage of the technique. Now, in the spirit of showing you every single brush stroke, I will be significantly speeding up the video. For the next stage, it's this, but all over the vehicle. So if you are painting alongside me a Volca Fenrica vehicle, and you did know what, and you wanted to see where to place a particular highlight or particular mark with the weathering technique with this stage, well, it's here for you to view. I tried to be quite ruthless in getting this down to around 15 to 20 minutes, and there is some pretty harsh head edits in this video, and it still came out at 32 minutes. This is a long video for you to concentrate on, but this is a masterclass when it comes to weathering. In this video, we'll look at how to do the traditional sponge chipping, oil weathering. We will also look at how you apply weathering powders to the vehicle, but we'll also be looking at how you create plasma and flame burns on the vehicle. If you'll notice, either side of the Mastodon there are a couple of flamer units, and then there's a huge melter unit at the front of the hull. Well, when they are no doubt flaming crowds of people to move them out the way, love this universe, you will inevitably burn some of the vehicle itself, and that's what we want to represent. I'll show you how to do that a little later on, but for now we'll be looking at how you create sponge chipping across the entirety of the vehicle. If you feel satisfied, you have a good idea of how to commit to this technique and perform it on your own miniature, and you don't want to watch every brush stroke, I advise you going forward, so skip the video along to 14 minutes in. I think it's 14 minutes 18 seconds, and that's where we start the weathering powder, the journey of the weathering powder. to keep in line with the highlighting we've built up with the airbrushing layers, I need the highlight to sit at the base, at the bottom of the sculpt. I know it feels a little unusual doing this, but it will pay dividends later on, especially when we start adding weathering powders on top and we create mud and dust flecks flicking up onto the side of the vehicle. Will all start to come together. It will all make sense. That there is a plan, I promise you. Well, you've seen the end result. If you like it, well, I assume you like it if you're watching this video. I hope you like it if you're watching this video. You'd be a bizarre person if you didn't. But, okay, this stage is made much easier by the angular. So it's a large, flat-headed brush. And when you place it against the hard edges, you could see it just picks up on those edges that you really want to show off when painting the lines of the vehicle. So even though this is, in a strict sense, an edge highlight, we're doing it in a bit more of a creative way to show off the sculpt and to add a layer of texture and chipping to the vehicle. It's so essential with something like this. When you look at the overall sculpt, it's very easy to have very soft blends, soft highlights. With this, we firm everything up. We make the miniature a lot more legible to read. So when we look at it, we understand what panel stands out against which, and we understand just at a glance what the vehicle is. And we can also do really nice things like chipping up the red wolf symbol and adding texture, adding some visual storytelling, because that's what weathering is. It's adding a story to your vehicle. Where has it been? Why has this mark appeared onto the vehicle? Why is this a chip here? Or what has happened in the course of the vehicle's life for it to be chipped in this particular area? So keep that in mind, be cognizant of that when you are creating your own blending techniques, when you are creating your own vehicles. Okay, next up, Flat Earth by Tamir. This is run through the airbrush, and this represents any dust effects and particles on the vehicle, and that goes right at the base. Just one thin coat. We aren't exactly aiming for a vast discoloration. We want a slight tint to it. The discoloration will come in when we use the weathering powder. The interior of the vehicle, we are giving a light dry brush of silver, again using that same pattern we used on the outside of the vehicle to chip up the edges while giving definition to the piece. Void shield generators can certainly do with an extra chip, as well as the hull plate. Again, adding this lighter silver does give us a more legibility, more readability of the miniature. Not only are we using the good old stipple brush or an older flat-headed brush, we are also relying on sponge. Now, it's something I haven't really addressed in other videos, but what kind of sponge do you use? It's not the kind of sponge that you use to wash your dishes with. No. Keep the packaging that your miniatures come with, especially Forge World miniatures, and that is the perfect consistency for the sponge needed for this kind of procedure. It also comes in Games Workshop bags and any kind of carrying case used in the industry, so KR foam, etc. That's the perfect kind of foam you need for this. You add a dollop of paint to a portion of the sponge, then you dab it off for roughly a dry brush consistency. We want the paint to struggle to impart anything onto the miniature. If we simply took the paint directly from the pot and applied it to the miniature, well, we end up with a big, huge, fat smudge, and that's not the effect we're looking for. We want to create incidental scratches here and there. Okay, next up I'm using AK Interactive Streaking Grime. I'm just applying this into all the areas, all the recesses of the miniature, where I think dirt and secretions would gradually build up. Now, when working with enamel, it's a very similar process to working with oils, in that it has a slower drying time than traditional acrylic paints, and they will need to be used with special additives. In this case, white spirits. It's the same stuff you use for oil paints that you can use for enamel. The only difference between enamel and oil paints is that enamels dry a lot quicker. Whereas with oil paints you'd need to wait around a week for it to fully and utterly dry, depending on the consistency of the paint and what thinning agents you use with it. With enamels it takes roughly about half an hour. So you get the same result, but in a lot less time, and this may be a bit of a godsend for those who do struggle with the drying times of oil paints. Now, oil paints, they're much more versatile in their application because you could buy huge tubes of them. With enamel paint, they often come pre-mixed, like the AK Interactive stuff I'm using here. So as you can see, I've added a small amount, just a dollop on a random area, allowed it to dry ever so slightly, and then rolled the brush down to create that grimy, worn and torn appearance to it. If you do have any follow-up questions on how to apply enamel paints, please let me know. In that case, in that example we saw there, it was practically the same as a panel, a line wash. But with the enamel paints, it's a lot quicker to dry, and I just bought some and I wanted to give it a try. So that's the reason why I use them. Okay, next up, weathering powders. Now, it's an incredibly frustrating experience, I know, because I recommend that you use MDP weathering powders, model display products powders. They're quite cheap, very good value for what they are. Other powders are available, other powders such as AK Interactive, you go through Forge World, all excellent. In this particular subject I'm using MDP, but because I've mixed up the tops I'm never really sure what colour exactly I'm using, so I'd urge you, like me, to rely on your eye, because in this particular instance we have no choice. In the background you've just seen me mix up a mixture of binding agents. Now, when we apply weathering powders to a miniature, unless we bind them in some way, unless we adhere them to the miniature, well, they'll just fly everywhere, they'll bounce everywhere, and they'll come off in your case and ruin your other miniatures. We need to mix up roughly 50-50 of matte varnish, in this case Lucky varnish, again by AK Interactive. You could tell I've been on a bit of a shopping spree with that store recently, so I'm using all their products. And spirits, low odor spirits, the same kind that you use to cut your oil paints with. So I've just added some into the recess, added some weathering powder, I've added a small amount of the thinner, and before the thinning agent made of the low odor thinner plus the matte varnish has dried, I'm just sprinkling a bit more on top. And what this will do, it will seep out, it will develop into the liquid, and once it dries it should stay on the miniature. Now, these techniques, they were developed by military scale modelers. These were techniques designed for vehicles that you'd never ever touch. So I would advise on top of this that you add a further layer of matte varnish to help bind it to the surface of the miniature. Now, when doing this procedure, it will darken down the weathering powder significantly, so don't be afraid to use lighter weathering powder, then overlaying it, building it up. When we are using a lighter version, it will darken down quite significantly when we apply the matte varnish, especially on top. So I would advise you, try it on a spare miniature first to see the end result. The drying times are very low. It won't take much long to experiment on the miniature, and it gives you a better idea of what the end result will be. when using the weathering powders, I try to imagine where dirt and mud and secretions would naturally build up. In this particular instance, any hard-edged area that could potentially shield sand or grit or mud, I'll apply a small amount of weathering powder to. When working with a miniature of this scale, it doesn't pay to be too mean with the application of your weathering powder, purely because it's such a large area, such a large piece. It can end up looking quite monochromatic, it can end up looking quite boring unless we break it up with things like this. Unless we break up the panels, unless we break it up with an effective highlighting scheme and weathering powder to give each panel a story that we want to tell. So I will be using a lot more weathering powder towards the base of the miniature, where the tracks will come into more contact with mud and grit and dirt, and I'll be overlapping the weathering powder techniques with dusting from my airbrush. Now, when working with weathering powder, it's very easy to really load up your brush and smash it onto the miniature. As with anything else, with our style of weathering powder, we're just on the eve of a new dawn of contrast paints, but in this particular instance, the old adage still remains: thin, multiple coats are best. If you slaver this stuff on, well, we run a very high risk of ruining the miniature. When we build up in multiple layers, we have ultimate control over the final result. We can allow areas to fully dry, we can analyze it, and then reapply if necessary. And when applying this, it does get very, very messy very quickly. It's cathartic, but it's very, very messy. So I always advise that you lay down some kind of maybe saran wrap, parafilm, cling film, that any excess weathering powder that spills over onto your desk, it's caught up there. You could simply scrunch that up and throw it away. For the environmentalists out there, you could either throw it down the toilet or you can burn it. Okay, so I've just added some more of a lighter sand coloured weathering powder there to give the impression that this is from a different campaign that hasn't quite wiped off altogether. And by adding a brown weathering powder to the grey, it adds so much more interest without running the risk of it looking like a stone. So we talked about in the previous episode when detailing how to create the grey. It's very easy to manipulate brown or maybe reds into the shadows, but then we'll end up with a stone-like appearance, which we don't necessarily want for this. I want to give the impression of a big mechanical machine, something that isn't natural or isn't naturally occurring. So by adding hints of blue into the shadows, it gives a mechanical feel. Now by adding the weathering powder in these stages, it looks like mud, it looks like a mechanical engine that's built up with grease and dirt and detritus. I'm just sprinkling some on the track. I'm mixing up the weathering powders, so I'm mixing the darker with the lighter. I'm sprinkling them on in random areas. It really does pay to have a random pattern here. When mud flicks onto a vehicle, it never ever does in uniform patterns, and you shouldn't feel hidebound to replicate this kind of scheme across your entire army, because the mud may be slightly older, might be slightly fresher on this machine in comparison to your Marines, which might be inside and come charging out and have a different layer of mud on their ceramite. So do not aim for uniformity above all else when creating a weathering scheme for your miniatures. Have a loose idea of where they are fighting, what kind of environments they're engaged in. Once both sides of the vehicle have been done, we can concentrate on the top. Now, there will be a certain amount of overspill from the front of the tracks. Dirt, sand will appear on the top, as well as Marines. So there's a top hatch where a Marine should be able to get in and out. So you can imagine they will be running across this quite a bit. Again, same process, same methodology, same way of thinking. Any hard-edged area where dirt, dust can build up, we want to concentrate on those areas. Now, because this is the top, there won't be as much of the weathering powder as there is on the side. What we're doing instead here is applying a lot more of our thinning agent than on the side, and less of the weathering powder afterward to bind it onto the surface, less of the flicking motion, the flicking technique. Because of this, the liquid will have the weathering powder flow into the gaps and recesses, so there will not be as much of a build-up. It won't be as immediate to the viewer, to the eye. But what this will do to the patient viewer, to somebody who really wants to take their time and appreciate the miniature, they can see how the weathering powders flowed into all the gaps and recesses, especially the hard edges where things can build up. When applying weathering powder like this, it's a real pleasure because it gives you an idea of the intricacy of the sculpt, how many small little details that are so easy to miss that you can really bring to the fore. I've added more weathering powder in that area to represent a Marine running up and down the back of the engine, correcting any mistakes, any overheating to the heat extraction. Mounted on the front of the vehicle, we have a flamer. Now, when these activate, when they douse down the enemies with torrents of flame, we will get blistering on the side of the vehicle. In order to simulate this, we use the hairdryer trick, hairspray trick rather. So I've just used the strongest hairspray that I have in the house. I've added that to the front of the vehicle where the blistering would occur, and then I'm using engine grime. Sorry, I had to look that up. I'm using engine grime through the airbrush. When you do this, it does need to be thinned with thinner, so make sure you are using your mask and you do have your extractor on for this, because it's nasty stuff you don't want to inhale. The reason why we are using enamel here is that it gives us a longer drying time. Next up, we use warm water, and it has to be Brecon Carreg. It's local water. It doesn't need to be Brecon Carreg. I'm using a sponge and an old paintbrush just to lift off tiny amounts to give that blistering effect. Gives that nice sooty blisters effect to the side of the vehicle. It's one of those subtle pieces of weathering that you can apply to miniatures to really tell a story, to give it that extra little bit of oomph that you otherwise will not have, you won't experience. And you could do this on dreadnoughts as well, so I refer you to this earlier seminars we did on how to weather a vehicle, how to weather a dreadnought chassis. And the same techniques were employed there, only overlapping one another to create a much stronger, more intense final result, because a Death Guard vehicle will be a lot more broken up and destroyed and weathered than a vehicle from the route, for example. And that is it. That is the weathering portion of the vehicle complete. Now in this particular example, I haven't overly weathered the vehicle. You can continue on with these techniques, overlapping them again and again and again to achieve the result that you want. But in this particular instance, I don't want an overly weathered vehicle. I want something that looks functional, that's something that's been in the field maybe a week rather than a couple of years. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you'll stick around for the next one. We have some amazing videos coming this month as part of the Patreon birthday. So we'll have Ralder on towards the end of the month. We'll also be having a look at the White Scars, especially the White Scar Praetor that I've painted up recently. Thank you very much. I'll catch you in the next vid. Bye bye.